Thanks, Joanne. Welcome, everybody. I'm excited to be here today with the lead authors of the book and an expert panel. Global Pediatric Development of Drugs, Biologics, and Medical Devices was just released at the end of November. It consists of 186 pages, comprised of 14 chapters, plus abbreviations, acronyms, glossary, and a very in-depth index to help people find things. We have a foreword that was provided by two senior executives from Critical Path Institute. So that's very excited that they're endorsing the book and provided us that foreword. We had a total of 19 global experts participate in the writing and reviewing of the chapters from 5 different countries. The book is available in print and electronic versions. I put in, or Joanne, if you can put in the chat, a link of where you can purchase the book and a link to the table of contents, so you can see the table of contents, each chapter, and then a list of the authors. The book is available for $130 for RACs members and $180 for non-members. I have the 2 lead authors, Linda McBride and Jocelyn Jennings, today, who created the scope and direction of the book, oversaw the development, oversaw the authors. And I also have 2 of the main authors, Karl-Heinz Huemer from the Austrian Agency for Health and Food Safety, and Allison Komiyama from Acknowledged Regulatory Strategies. So thank you for joining. I may also have some other authors on the panel today, so please, authors, chime in when we start asking questions and give us your perspective from being on the writing team. Before I get into the questions, I want to talk a little bit about the development process. As Joanne mentioned, I'm Gloria Hall. I'm the senior editor of publications. So I work in collaboration with our editorial advisory committee to decide on topics for books for RAPs. We do a 3-year calendar on not only the fundamental series, but also topic focused books like pediatrics. So we are always looking for volunteer writers and reviewers for all of our chapters. We set up an independent review process for all of our book chapters. So not only do the lead editors take a look at those chapters, there are chapters that have an independent review, and we have a process for that. So if you are interested in learning more about the editorial advisory committee and the book development process, please send me an email at ghall@raps.org, and I can give you some information on how to get more involved with RAPs. So without further ado, I wanted to start off the conversation with Jocelyn and Linda and talk a little bit about how you decided to structure the book, how you decided to include the regions and countries that you selected, and how that thought process works. Linda, do you want to start out first about really the thought behind why we needed a book on pediatrics? Pediatrics has been covered in fundamentals over the years as a standalone chapter, and we've done sessions at Convergence. But why now? Why now did we decide to put together a full book on pediatrics?
Absolutely. Thanks, Gloria. I think first and foremost, one of the basis, I think the primary basis for development or the need for a book on pediatrics was that there was more than just US and European regulations requiring development of pediatrics. And I think that there might have been some confusion or some thoughts about, oh, well, it's only the US and Europe that requires or even has incentives, and as well as, I think, help from the regulatory authorities. And it was really to, I think, get past the myths and really look at the facts and who requires what, where are their incentives. And also, I think, to promote the thought process when it comes to pediatric development, because as more of us are involved with the development of drugs for children, we realize that often companies think too late about incorporating pediatrics into their development programs. And I know this is one of the things that in my interactions with Karl-Heinz over the past few years, he continues to remind me is that really the industry should be thinking about incorporating pediatric strategy early on in their development, even at the same time as you are kicking off your program for adults.
Jocelyn, anything to add?
I just would second what Linda has said. And then additionally, I know that as a regulatory professional, it's really hard to find information on topics all in one place. You have to look in multiple places. And so I think a lot of the books that RAPS is championing are great because they cover a topic and the information you need from various countries are there. Another good thing that you mentioned are the acronyms, the abbreviations, and we also for each chapter have detailed references. And so again, it's hard to go to a regulator's website and you may remember, oh, I think there's a guidance on X, but then you can't find it because they're changing their websites all of the time, or the way you've put in the keywords just doesn't bring it up. And so that's another great thing, is that the references are right there. You can use them. It can take you right to the guidances or standards or other information. And so I think it's just great to have a reference book that provides the information that you need all in one place for this particular topic.
Thank you, Jocelyn. So in the book, we've covered the regulatory requirements for the major markets: US, EU, Switzerland, UK, Canada, Australia, Japan, China, plus Middle East and Latin America. So what was the thought process behind deciding which countries to include, especially given that some of those countries and regions don't have specific pediatric regulations? And that could be for anyone on the panel.
This is Jocelyn. I will say from my perspective, it was just trying to get as much information as possible and to cover as many countries and as many regions as we possibly could. And a lot of it is dictated by volunteers and experts who can write the chapters. So there were incidents where you might want a country, but you may not be able to find the subject matter expert who can author that chapter. But as much as possible, we tried to cover a wide range of markets and regions to provide that information for the readers.
Yeah, and echoing Jocelyn's comments there, I think if anything, I think as I said in some of the opening statements, was that most persons, when they think about pediatric development, they think about the requirements specifically from Europe as well as the US. And the intent here was to really be inclusive and think about, even many other countries that actually are utilized for clinical trials in order to get the population needed. I mean, especially in the area of rare diseases. So I think as persons take a look at the table of contents, they'll see that we have, of course, as you've stated, Gloria, the major regions covered, including Asia Pacific as well as Latin America. But then we also included a chapter, Rest of World, where we gathered information from many countries, considering, Africa, Russia, and the Middle East. Just as a reminder that, granted, there may not be requirements, but there could be incentives for developing drugs for children. And then also too, not to forget, as I already mentioned, about, especially in the cases of rare disease, clinical trials are conducted outside of the US and Europe. And so those requirements, from a clinical trial perspective, need to be considered.
Okay, thank you.
I'll just add,
Um,
I think that was one of the most exciting things when I saw the outline of the book that you sent through, Gloria, was I am so focused on US regulations and medical devices. My worldview is very US focused. So seeing all the different countries that the authors were able to pull together is very exciting to also, tell my clients that have pediatric devices to go buy this book, because perhaps there's something that you can learn about, your global strategy, and maybe try, as Linda was saying, start your clinical study elsewhere, or what are the other incentives globally that you could use to try and support your product, your device, or your drug to enter multiple countries. So I think that was a really excellent part of the book that was offered.
Awesome. Thank you, Allison. Allison, let me ask you this question. What are the ways that the US is promoting pediatric device innovation?
Great question. We've seen a lot change in the US in the past couple of years. One of the things is FDA hired Dr. Vasum Paris, who is a chief medical officer with the Center for Devices and Radiologic Health, but also just overseeing a lot of the programs for, I think he's part of the strategic partnerships and technological innovation, one of those acronyms. I'm not remembering the full thing, but he has really been on board with trying to promote pediatric devices, and how does he how can he support all the different efforts within the different offices of health technology at FDA to try and promote companies and incentivize companies to really think about pediatrics. I think there's been, sort of a stigma against trying to do any testing or pursue a pediatric indication, for the main reason, what if a kid gets hurt or dies? That's, it can be really bad press for that company. Equally, pediatrics is 1/5 of the population that you could go for if you're going for an adult indication. So those are terrible reasons to not try and help kids, right? So FDA has said, how can we kind of change that mind frame of and promote again? You were saying earlier, Gloria, protect and promote, right? That's kind of what the book is trying to do as well, is trying to figure out where are the ways that different countries are trying to promote this. So we've seen FDA do a couple different things in the past 5-10 years. One of them is the Pediatric Device Consortia. So FDA put a bunch of money into, or I should say in 2007, Congress passed the legislation to establish funds for these pediatric medical device development consortia. So in 2017, FDARA again put money into this program, and essentially FDA puts money towards key initiatives and funds different grant recipients. So there's 5 of them in the US that have been recipients of these grants. One that I work with, because I'm in Southern California, we work a lot with the West Coast Consortium for Technology and Innovation in Pediatrics, which is CTIP. The other thing that Vasum, or Dr. Paris, at FDA has been really pushing and really promoting is the System for Hospitals for Innovation in Pediatrics for medical devices. So that's SHIP-MD. Also something that's funded, or promoted by Critical Path Institute, AdvaMed, the American Academy of Pediatrics. And so really trying to create these ecosystems to make it easier for companies to put their pediatric indications at the forefront of their mind. So really exciting. We talk a lot about it in the book and different ways that companies can get involved in those programs.
Okay, thank you. Karl-Heinz, what about other countries or regions supporting pediatric products getting to markets, particularly Europe? Can you address that?
Yeah, no, just as I heard Allison talking about medical devices a lot. In Europe, they are not at all regulated. They are not part of the pediatric regulation. Medical devices in general are not in the remit of the European Medicines Agency. Actually, there is no agency in Europe that would cover that, no regulation, and here the problems begin. So you have to find scientific solutions, and you have to try to find somehow programs that fit to such also quite different requirements in different regions. Yeah, and as mentioned by Linda, mostly as there are the requirements, specific regulations for pediatric in the US and in the European Union, that's of course at the focus. But you have to take into account that depending who is the developer of a product, he will be looking at completely different markets. It will very often not be possible to develop a specific program. So we are really forced to find common solutions, because otherwise it doesn't get handleable, especially in rare conditions, to generate any data. So a global approach is very important. And then now many other countries, I just imagine, let's say each country comes up with a pediatric regulation, it would be even less handleable. So we try to foster dialogue, to include other countries. One of the later questions is, for example, about cluster disease. So all countries are invited to participate, to see where US and Europe are coming from, might take up many of that, mostly wouldn't implement it in a regulation, but very often provide some incentives, also that patients in their country could benefit from being included in trials. So it's a fascinating, complicated topic from a scientific and regulatory perspective. And in Europe, yeah, I'm actually, honestly, it's not even easy to handle the pediatric regulation. There is an interpretation of it. So, and I have seen that clearly when writing my chapter on the European PIP, some details are hardly in reality implemented. Others are taken very serious. So the regulation is also only a starting point. And as pointed out in my chapter, there is a revision plan. So it's a moving target. And also the RACE Act in the US is a quite recent addition to the requirements. So we still try to catch up with reality.
Okay, thank you, Karl-Heinz. I did have a question in the Q&A. Please share the logic you use to actually define pediatric population up front and set the tone of the book, especially considering that some markets define pediatric by age 28 days to 21 years, while some markets and industries focus on weight rather than age. How did you achieve a balance between these various definitions? To anyone on the panel.
So for the US, for the US, I'll just say that we use the information that comes from the US regulations, and that's pretty, I think it's like on the first, could be on the first or second page of the US chapter. And so, you know, for each chapter, if there's a particular definition of pediatrics for those regions, then those were included in those chapters.
Okay.
Yeah, the same for Europe. Of course, we have to take into account and respect what the regulation says. And that for Europe would say minors are up to 18 years. That is legally in some countries, for other contexts, even slightly different. So which age is necessary to agree on an informed consent on your own? That's not even aligned in Europe. So it has a lot of legal implications, but don't get lost. Laws are laws, and there is some practicability, and we still find ways to word things to, on one side, make a scientific useful proposal, and on the other side, still respect what we have to require from our regulations. So let's say if you have a patient of 20 years of age, it might formally not be included in a pediatric investigation plan because this is only up to 18, but data from a 20-year-old very well would be supportive. So in the assessment afterwards, it might not be so critical as it sounds in the first. In some cases, so when you talk here about weight, it's a kind of routine that we mostly agree on waivers for age ranges. I very often would encourage to rather propose, let's say, weight or whatever other parameters, pubertal, so hormone status, all these, if you find a scientific useful argument. I think these formalisms and laws are like that, are not the main hurdle. We will find solution. That's also part of our cluster discussions. How can we in our respective regulation word it in a way that it doesn't block something else? So for example, if we say up to 18 and you say, well, we would like to see some up to 20, yeah, then we have slightly different numbers, and they probably will include some slightly older ones, are definitely supportive for us as well, and so on. So it's really, I would like to stress we rather focus on scientific solutions and not only implement strictly laws.
Yeah, I agree with that. FDA has been, they've tried to at least give guidelines of what are the different ages, right? Because it's not just 28 days, or like the person who asked the question, it's neonates, right? So it is really from birth. FDA has then broken it down from infant, child, adolescent. There's actually 2 transitional adolescent periods, really between 18 and 21, if there should be special consideration. And then there's an transitional adolescent B, if there are no special considerations. And then they also have broken it down by weight. I think the biggest thing to keep in mind when you're thinking about what pediatric population you're going for your device or drug is to understand what are the specific features of that pediatric population that you need to take into account when you're thinking about your testing. Because sometimes FDA, and we've seen it very across the different offices at FDA, because some of the lead reviewers will say, actually, we do see this pediatric population as small adults, for some diseases or some, areas that they're going to. And other times FDA says, this is a totally different population. You have to think about them very differently. So having those early, pre-submissions or whatever you need to do with FDA to get their feedback on that. FDA is very interested in getting these pediatric conversations started. I know when you asked about the incentives earlier, I totally forgot. All FDA files for CDRH, all of de novos, 510Ks, PMAs for pediatric indications, they're all free. So it's all the user fees are waived. And I think that's one of the, many incentives they're trying to put forward so that you can have these conversations about what is the difference in your population you're going after.
Thank you, Allison. Karl-Heinz, going back to cluster calls, besides EMA and FDA, what other regulatory authorities participate? And can a sponsor participate in the cluster calls?
Well, mostly they are driven by FDA and the European Union. So they are, in practice, they are bilateral. Other countries are invited. So for example, Canada or Japan or Australia often participate in a rather observer role, is my practical perception. In some cases, of course, they could contribute, but that's it. So it's open to other regulatory agencies and regions, not to sponsors. And I would like I want you to understand that this is also an advantage, because if we talk among us, first confidentiality agreements, that means we can talk about a specific development program to refer to, which is of course not available to the public. We might also quite openly raise sometimes points where we have a problem with the other approach for whatever scientific, whatever reasons, which doesn't need to be always obvious. So we try to find common ways forward. But the starting point in a confidential discussion allows sometimes to be simply clearer on where do we disagree and how can we find an agreement. So I see this really also, you get an outcome. So normally you are informed that we had some discussion. We very often have then a common, how do we call it, a common commentary where the output is then put forward to the company for information, where, for example, I remember a recent one, Europe, like often was much more strict than the US, and they asked us, do you really think that's useful or needed? And I said, well, actually, I personally fully agree to you, but we had to be in line with earlier PIPs. So it's really discussion on such a level sometimes where internal discussion, I think, can lead to solutions better than we have to be very politically correct to the outside because sponsors are listening. That was a very frank response, I guess.
No, thank you, Karl-Heinz. So in addition to Europe and US, what other countries have requirements versus incentives? And that can be for anyone on the panel.
So I think the easy question or the easy response here is all those details are included in the book from a country by country perspective. You know, I think it's difficult to go country by country, but at least, you know, I think everyone is aware that both Europe as well as the US have requirements for pediatric development. I think also too worth noting is that with Brexit, the UK has established requirements as well, similar to Switzerland. I think one of the big learnings that I had as I was reviewing content was there's a lot of information that is included in the book about China and their support for pediatric development. So I think if anything, you know, echoing a statement that Jocelyn made earlier, you know, really we strive to have a book about pediatric development that was inclusive to cover everything that we know today when it comes to pediatric development, as well as even how you can leverage, if there's not a requirement, what is required when it comes to getting a product approved in countries. And so with that being said, I don't know, Jocelyn, if there's something else you wanted to add here?
No, thank you, Linda. I think you covered it well.
One point, I want to repeat what Linda said earlier. It's not only about the regulation that require development in children. There is a lot of other regulations, from clinical trials to legal implications to so many other things have to be considered. So whether someone specifically asks for a pediatric trial or something like that is only one of many points that you will have to consider. And especially in clinical trials, you very often go outside these two regions for simply feasibility or recruitment issues. So you will have to explore. And that's the other thing that Linda said earlier. So start early. It might be quite challenging to get all the answers in time if you postpone researching that.
Yeah, that's definitely something I've heard you say multiple times, Karl-Heinz, is that especially when it comes to going to EMA for advice as a company is developing their PIP, go early in order to understand the current climate. And I think the same holds true when it comes to any of the regulatory authorities as you're considering pursuing development of a drug or medical device for children, is that really the regulatory authorities are there to help you navigate. And I think if anything granted, also help when you've got a challenge, because one region or country requires a certain specific aspect of development that may not be required or even maybe decided against for another country. So when it comes to pediatric development, you know, think about it early, think about it often.
I think I love that. I think thinking about it early also allows you to see if maybe there's some sort of regulatory strategy that could benefit your long-term goals, right? We have one client right now that we've completely pivoted because it's actually easier to submit for a de novo for the pediatric indications first. As I mentioned earlier, it's a free submission, and the extrapolation of using the pediatric data to then expand on those indications for the adult population is going to be much easier at that point. And so there may be a time to market consideration in there as well. Maybe it's faster to start with pediatrics first.
Thank you.
And I think too, it's also worth noting that many of the diseases are really impact the pediatric population more so than the adult population. So I think it's important here to note that this book doesn't just focus on a development program where you start in adults first and then move to pediatrics. I think there's also much content that is provided when it comes to if you're looking at a pediatric disease first, whether it's rare or not, and under the orphan disease or even the rare disease stipulations here in the US. So I think that's one of the benefits is that we try to ingrain into this book is that there's many ways to look at pediatric development and one size does not fit all.
I think that kind of dovetails really well with the question that's been posted. Do you mind if I take a stab at it, Gloria?
Do you want me to read the question?
Sure, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, question from the audience. Scarcity of prescription drug and medical device is a long-standing problem to cause off-label use in clinical settings. Initiatives from US FDA is a great start to support from development stage, but I believe one of the big hurdles in industry perspective would be low return on investment, not only development. Is there any regulation or policy on discussion to support financially aftermarket?
It's a fantastic question and something that has come up in a lot of the conversations with the SHIP-MD and device consortia that I talked about earlier. There isn't yet, right? I think as soon as FDA clears or grants a device, oftentimes that's their involvement. Of course, they're going to, be in charge of inspections and whatnot, but there's not so much in the way of incentives for post-market and for reimbursement purposes. And because of that, FDA is trying to figure out creative ways to help with that issue. One of the things that has been discussed, and none of these have been, approved or have been made into regulation yet, but is to have something similar to what the Breakthrough Devices program has done, or the Safer Technology Entrance program, STEP program at FDA has done, and that's to generate a unique program for pediatrics that may have some connection to CMS or the I always get Medicaid, Medicare mixed, but essentially to help with support for reimbursement for pediatric devices, because if anyone's been following the breakthrough implications for reimbursement over the past year, and there's been a lot of great articles and raps about it, because FDA I should say Congress keeps kind of changing their mind on whether or not they're going to allow MCIT to go through. Having some sort of program in place that can really incentivize companies to say, okay, not only are we going to be, first to market, and we have all these, free submissions that we can do with FDA, but once we get to market, then we're going to have an easier time for reimbursement. That would be a huge win, and I think it would really help push forward companies to invest in this space.
Thank you.
I don't know with other countries though, if there's anything. I'm curious to Karl-Heinz if you've heard anything in Europe.
Yeah, in Europe, that's a nightmare. We still are many separate countries. Incentives, reimbursement, this is a national responsibility. So there is no unified way in Europe that goes beyond patent. And that makes it really very difficult. So when I wonder, what I read in this question, sorry, was what was the wording? Something like it doesn't pay itself, so it's not paid back. I would like to see that different. The pediatric development is a legal requirement within a development program, so that the pediatric development has to create the income from the pediatric formulation is something that I would challenge. You would not, for example, you have to do a quality program, you have to do non-clinical studies. They don't pay off on themselves. They are an implemental part of the whole development. So I think we should find some ways that the cost of a product is more evenly spread between different age ranges, for example, and not that we skip pediatric because we don't have many pediatric patients. And one other thing I would like to mention, pediatric formulations, for example. I would think that mostly adults also would prefer a smaller tablet that can easily be swallowed, especially if they're handicapped. I'm sure most adults are happy if it does not taste awful. So the benefit might well go beyond the pediatric population. So saying we have so much problems with the pediatric formulation, but then the others benefit as well. So you could start from the beginning to develop a formulation that fits to all age ranges better, for example.
Thank you, Karl-Heinz. I have another question from the audience. Do you recommend having a joint discussion on pediatric development plans with FDA, EMA early on, if allowed? Are there pros and cons in this approach?
Sorry, I just opened my mic but didn't raise my hand. I guess that's a bit logic to me. I would recommend it wherever you find ready to do that. Then you would start actually not at the pediatric committee, which has to be done earlier than the FDA. So in Europe, you should come at the end of phase 1, something like that. So we are a bit more challenging here. But you could submit a scientific advice before that. And unfortunately not used very often. You could do that in parallel. So you could ask for a parallel scientific advice, FDA and Europe. We might not agree on all aspects, but it's interesting for me, but because it would definitely introduce a common discussion where both sides could start to consider the problems that might pop up. So I would recommend it. I guess both sides would not even raise fees. Scientific advice is not free of charge in Europe unless it's pediatric only. Then you don't have to pay anything. The FDA is also free of charge. So you don't even have to pay it. You have to put some efforts in, having the good questions. There is also an option for follow-up if needed. Do it.
I agree. I think one of the benefits of doing a pre-submission, especially again, I'm only focused on medical devices, is you can get a pediatrician in the room. FDA has a handful of them, and you can request certain attendees that you'd like as part of the pre-submission meeting. And so having them in the room to, run by what are some additional considerations we should think about if we're also considering a pediatric population. We had one of the medical officers so excited. He was practicing as well. And he said, I want your device in my practice. Like, here are the things that I think you're going to need to address to make sure that this is, safe and effective in children. But I want to help you move this product forward. So do come back to us more frequently or email me. That's always the nice thing. If they're like, you can email me directly, keep your lead reviewer CC'd on it, but let's be, work together and collaborate on this. And I think that's one of the best things that can come out, especially if you do bring up the pediatric development plans within that pre-submission process.
Thanks, Allison. We have another question. While developing the content for the book, what pain points did you consider in terms of pediatric drug development? Clinical and regulatory, i.e. cost, time investment, resource constraints, any common complaints in terms of developing a strong pediatric development strategy? 。 I think Linda or Jocelyn for either of you.
This is Jocelyn. So I don't know if we looked at it as pain points. I will just say that drug development as a whole, we all know is challenging. And for pediatrics, it makes it more so just because of the ages that could be involved. But I mean, across the board, it's just different things that you have to think about. So for your non-clinical, you may think about, okay, I've got to do these types of studies in these types of animals. But then the question is, okay, from a pediatric standpoint, do you need to include a study with juvenile animals? Can that be incorporated into your strategy for your non-clinical testing? And then as Karl-Heinz was talking about, as far as formulations are concerned, you may have a disease that covers a wide range of ages. And so the question is, will the formulation you're looking at, maybe it's a capsule, is that really something that you can introduce to a 2-year-old? It may be good for, 18 to 65, but then over 65, could you look at something else? And so there's just a lot of things that you need to start thinking about very early on and mapping out what your strategy should be for your non-clinical, any of your starting testing, your research and development, all the way through how you could design your clinical trials. Do you need to do any human factors testing? This is a huge area, as Allison can probably discuss. For medical devices, that's pretty much a no-brainer to do human factors testing, but not so much with drugs and biologics. But it is a question that is coming more often from FDA. Have you done these, have you looked at having focus groups or user groups to look at your products and how they're used, how they're taken? What does your package look like? Can this easily be used depending on the age? And you have to look at also caregivers. So this, there's just a lot to think about. And I think these are all points that you have to deal with anyway in drug development. You just have to put on a different mindset or a different thinking cap when you're looking at it from a pediatric standpoint. And then it may be that you want to look at staggering your program. So there's just a lot to consider.
Thank you, Jocelyn. Anybody else? Okay, Jocelyn, another question for you. With the implementation of the RACE Act in the US, how best to engage with FDA to discuss our pediatric plan?
I think always the best way to interact with FDA is to schedule a meeting. They have a guidance on formal meetings with FDA. So the earlier you can start the conversations with them, the better. As long as you have done enough that you know the questions you want to ask, the type of information you want to present, and the questions that come from that, because you want to have a good package to present to them with enough early data that they can actually review and answer your questions. So I always say to meet with FDA as early and as often as possible.
Okay. Anybody else? Okay. So Karl-Heinz, is simultaneous advice from regulatory authorities recommended for a pediatric development program?
That's actually quite similar to the question we had before, isn't it? So the advice, there is a format that is called parallel scientific advice. So it would not be a PIP submission yet. We are also discussing possible earlier interactions at the pediatric committee, which seems to be formally a bit complicated. We might foresee some flexibility here if we revise the regulation, but a parallel scientific advice request should be possible anytime. So you basically ask both agencies, we would like to have that. In the meantime, I also have the impression that the FDA is quite fast assigning you a slot. EMA is very eager to provide an extremely fast slot within a month or so. So we simply align then so that we really start in parallel. And if you submit questions to both, we can work off them and comment on the other side's view. That would be my proposal. The submission for PIP and the PSP would be after that. But yeah, that's, if you have a common way forward, that should definitely make it easier. Therefore, I would recommend it wherever you feel ready to dare to approach both.
Okay. Thank you. Anybody else?
I was going to add about faster interaction time with FDA. It definitely helps if you have breakthrough status. And so the breakthrough program can give you these sprint discussions, which can have a very fast turnaround time of interactions with FDA, sometimes on the order of 21 days, 14 days to 21 days to get feedback about your clinical study, your animal testing. And we have noticed that so the breakthrough program, it has many different criteria that you need to fulfill, but you need to have a reasonable expectation that you will be more effective than what else is out there. If you already have a medical device that's on the market for an adult population and you're interested in shifting and adding the indications for pediatric population, and you believe that it'll be more effective in that population because maybe the alternatives really are drugs, or really it's off, one of the previous questions, it is off-label use of the adult product. Maybe it is a good idea to consider applying for the breakthrough pathway. And if there's likelihood that it's going to be clinically and technically successful, which you have the adult device maybe already on the market, it's likely going to work in the pediatric population, providing some information to bridge that for FDA so they understand that, yes, this will likely work in pediatrics. If you can get that breakthrough, if it's a life-threatening or irreversibly debilitating disease, then you can also have those really fast turnaround time conversations with FDA. So, and the breakthrough pathway, 60-day turnaround time after you submit it, they'll make a decision within 60 days. And then after that, you can have those sprint discussions and also usually faster pre-submission meetings with them as well.
Okay. Thank you, Allison. I want to remind the panel. Oh, go ahead, Colin.
I must confess, 21 days is completely unrealistic in Europe. We still have to align with the different national agencies. So if we are fast, it might be 40 days. And the PIP is longer still. Well, we could agree on day 30, but it is still a 60-day procedure because it doesn't start at 0, but at day -30. But we try to be fast, and I know EMA always wants to beat FDA. They apparently don't manage.
I will say it depends on the group, right? Some of the groups at FDA are like,
yeah,
no,
this is the formalized procedure which we can't simply overrule. Just shortly replying to a comment I see from Ravitsa Asura, the ICH E11 is a starting point for discussion, but it is not an obligation. So if you know that the disease starts from 8 years on or whatever, if you have a scientific argument, a clinical, whatever, that would overrule the recommended age categorizations by ICH. It's very often a good solution. What I very practically often see, a company discusses an adult program and then starts with 18 downwards, completely separate. That's because there is this age cut off whenever in Europe people are adult, but that doesn't mean you cannot include adolescents in the adult trial. So really try to be driven by scientific clinical arguments and not just on formal categories as suggested by ICH E11.
Thank you, Karl-Heinz. Another question from the panel: Are there fees charged for review of PSP submissions for orphan drugs?
No.
No.
FDA doesn't charge any fees for any of their meetings. So, oh, sorry, there's an echo, but so no, there's no fees for that.
If I recall correctly, the only time FDA charges fees for any drugs for these meeting types is for biosimilars. So wouldn't be, I think, applicable for, I think, the question here regarding an orphan drug PSP meeting or submission.
So we have about 6 minutes. I wanted to just ask each of the panel the same question, and that would be, I'll start with Karl-Heinz. In your opinion, the #1 takeaway from your chapter or the book, was there an aha, wow, this is really important, this is really why people should read the book? So a #1 takeaway.
I probably would suggest come with a scientific and clinical proposal. It has to be aligned with the regulation, but it should be driven by what is needed by children, what can my product contribute to that, and how can I show that? Not this is a regulatory requirement. We find flexible solutions if the proposal makes sense. Very short, as I see a short question here, fees at PDCO. PDCO is free of charge also. The only thing you would have to pay for is when you ask for a scientific advice where the questions are not only pediatric. If there are orphans, also for adults. So standard scientific advice with one pediatric question you would have to pay, but pediatric PDCO is without any charges. So that's it.
Mm-hmm. Allison, your #1 takeaway, either from the chapter that you wrote or other chapters?
I think that this is companies that are interested in getting into the pediatric space are coming at a really great time. I think, kids get sick, and kids need help. And I think that's something that FDA has put a lot of attention in, that we can't forget about these populations just because, they're a smaller population of the US, or that they, there's not a good financial reason to go into that space. So I think FDA has been putting a lot of interest and also funding, right? Putting money into these various programs to really promote pediatric indications for devices and also for drugs. And I just think we definitely went through that in the chapter, and then also gave case examples of a 510K, a de novo, a PMA, and what are the different tests that those companies needed to do in order to get onto the market. So it was really fun being part of the writing of the chapter, and also just being part of such a dynamic group. So yeah, thank you to Jocelyn and Linda as well. Thanks.
Thanks, Allison. Jocelyn, from your perspective, either from the chapters that you wrote or reviewing the other chapters, your #1 takeaway.
I think it's just what we've all said, which is you just really need to think about it as early as possible in the development and working on the strategy for whatever the product may be, because the earlier that you start to think about it, the earlier you can start having discussions with the regulators and really hone in on what is needed that will get your product eventually on the market. And of course, like I was saying earlier, meet with FDA as often as they will allow, and really look at their other incentive programs. I mean, they have QIDP, so fast track designation. If your product, the disease or condition meets any of these are other things to really look at.
Thank you, Jocelyn. Linda, save the last for you.
Thanks, Gloria.
Key takeaway.
I think my key takeaway is that, when it comes to working with all the authors, and of course with you, Gloria, on this book, I think that bringing a product to the market for the pediatric population, I mean, is quite fulfilling. I mean, all of us were children once. And, you know, considering that, I mean, last I saw, you know, more than 80% of the drugs that are utilized in the pediatric population are off-label. And just thinking about the opportunity that's out there that we can show that various products are safe and effective. And when I think about products, I'm thinking holistically, both drugs, biologics, as well as medical devices. And really, I feel like this book is such a resource for not just us working in the industry, but also for academia, as well as regulatory authorities, that it's holistic. It makes us, it reminds us that it's not just about where each of us reside from a regional standpoint. It's thinking about our development programs globally, rather than just where we sit today in our offices or at the facility that we work at.
Okay, thank you so much. We are just about out of time. Thank you to the panel, Karl-Heinz, Jocelyn, Linda, Allison. Appreciate your conversation and your sharing your thoughts on the book. If anyone's interested in learning more about the book development process, again, I'm Gloria Hall, ghall@reps.org. Send me an email. And I appreciate your time today, and thank you for the attendees. We had 49 attendees today, and most stayed for the whole hour, so appreciate that. So thank you. Everyone take a look at that book, and happy holidays.
Thanks, Gloria.
Thank you.
Gloria. Thanks all. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.